There's something about Silverstone in the summertime. It's not just that the circuit hosted Formula One's first ever World Championship round. Back then, the circuit was a cobbled together mix of runways and taxiways of a rundown old airfield. But what happened around that old airfield is what really changed Formula One. At the beginning of the World Championship, the sport was utterly dominated by big manufacturer teams, Alfa Romeo, Ferrari, later on Mercedes. And some of those names, of course, are still in the sport today. But what happened at Silverstone and in the area around it in the subsequent years saw English engineering take over the sport of Formula One. Such was the time that every single car on the grid had a chassis made in the UK. Well, times have changed a little bit. Today, only 6 out of the 10 teams have English designed and built chassis. However, it is still that centre of innovation. No car on the grid operates without at least one British-made component. And as we look down the field at the British Grand Prix in 2024, a lot of new bits and pieces are on display. And I think the first thing we need to do is start with the most home of the home teams. Aston Martin, based just over the road from the main entrance of the circuit. Well, they've brought a few new parts to take an interesting look at, and the best person to describe them, Tom McCulloch from the team.
Yeah, we've been trying to bring updates to as many races as possible. We very rarely run the same car here. We've got an updated front wing and some elements on the rear brake ducts that have changed. So part of the standard updates, we've been trying to bring the parts from the factory. The factory never stops, the lights never go out just over the road there, pushing hard to bring some performance parts to the track.
Now, Aston Martin's upgrades are not just those front wing and those aero parts that we just heard described. Actually, perhaps the biggest upgrade to the Aston Martin team is that factory over the road from the main gate at Silverstone, and also some of the personnel. Andy Cowell, notably the man who masterminded Mercedes' power unit dominance of the current era, has joined the team after a long spell of gardening leave. Tom McCulloch again explains what has changed in the Aston Martin team.
It's a really exciting time at the moment in the new campus. You know, building 1 we obviously moved into a year ago, building 2 and 3, which the wind tunnel is all coming online, the new simulator, just space for everybody to have their own environment where to sit. It's a fantastic place. I still smile every day when I walk in there.
A big signing announced earlier this week, of course, Andy Cowell joining a lot of expertise, experience in Formula One. What is he going to bring to the Aston Martin project going forward?
Obviously, Andy's got a wealth of experience from his time at formerly Cosworth and then Mercedes. You know, Martin's worked with him in the past. Martin's been instrumental in the campus development and where we are as a team now, with a lot of the big strategic thinking. And I think having somebody like Andy take on from that, there's going to be a good handover period between the two of them. It's that calibre of person that you're wanting to help see the big picture, make the big decisions to make the team keep striding forwards like we are doing.
Now, another team that's had big factory upgrades recently is McLaren, and some of the fruits of those upgrades, particularly the wind tunnel, were on display last time out in Austria. And I have to say, the upgrade that caught everybody's eye was to the front wing. Now, this is the front wing end plate that the team had used in previous races, and I just want to draw your attention to the rear edge, the trailing edge. Very straight, very much pretty standard, no big differences, nothing particularly special to see there. Then have a look at the upgraded version. Significantly more sculpted, a lot more curvy, and a little bit more detailed, particularly down here in the area where the team are just managing how those front wing elements join the roll tip of the end plate. But when you look at that front wing end plate from a different angle, it really draws the attention. And this is what everybody was calling the stopper, perhaps, or the big spike on the rear of the end plate. Now, a lot of people have asked the question on social media since the Austrian Grand Prix, did this spike cause those punctures at the end of the Grand Prix? And if you're not sure what I'm talking about, have a watch of this. Now, here we are on board with Max Verstappen looking back at the McLaren of Lando Norris in the closing stages of the Austrian Grand Prix. Now, I'll roll it forward. You all know by this point what's about to happen, but have a look at this first impact, the one that actually causes the puncture for Max Verstappen. And as you can see, it's a rear-to-rear contact with the McLaren. Nothing to do with that front wing end plate design. Aha, some of you say at home. What about the second impact where the car does definitely hit the front wing end plate? Absolutely, that's true. You saw it there, but the impact of that front wing end plate was on the forward part of the front wing end plate and not the bit where that spike was. So while that big spiky front wing does look quite aggressive. Nothing to do with the damage on the Red Bull. That was more down to the two drivers and how they decided to take that corner in the closing stages of the race. Well, let's find out a little bit more about that front wing, and who better to ask than Andrea Stella. He's down in the pit lane.
Like you can see, the wing works very close to the tire, and the tire is the most non-aerodynamic object that you can have, and therefore it's quite challenging for the wing to be able to manipulate the flow in such a proximity to the tire. And also we need to remember that the tire moves, so the position between the wing and the wheel changes because of the steer angle. So it's a very complex problem from an aerodynamic point of view, and we bring this development to see and to confirm that the development direction is it works.
And such a critical part, as you say, of that airflow is the channeling through the suspension. I know you've made some front suspension changes this weekend as well. Could you talk us through those?
When you update the front wing, you always kind of need to look at the components that work in combination with the front wing. In this sense, we'd rather talk about a front system, which includes the brake ducts, the suspension. So naturally, you have to tune some of these components in order to optimize not only the work of the front wing, but also the flow that goes to the back of the car. So it's not a surprise that when you have front wing developments, I think we have seen this in other submissions, you also come with adjustments of shrouds. Certainly I've seen a lot of work on Mercedes from this point of view as well.
But McLaren's upgrades haven't stopped there. Coming into Silverstone, they've introduced a new rear wing, but also they've introduced, well, I kind of got a bit stuck on how many different iterations of beam wing the team had got. On the official documentation that the team filed with the FIA before every Grand Prix, McLaren had 3 separate lower beam wings introduced for Silverstone: a high downforce version, a medium downforce version, and a low downforce version, which I think is this version with just the single element. But they've been playing around massively at the back of the car. Will it bear through? I'm not sure. Now, the weather at Silverstone isn't known to be particularly wonderful. I mean, let's admit, it always rains at Silverstone. Sometimes it's very hot. Generally, it's a bit chilly and windy. And that's why it's a bit of a surprise for me that McLaren has decided to open up the cooling, completely changing the cooling layout of the car for this weekend. And I think they're going to run with this for the rest of the season. Now, have a look at this design. This is the back end of the car in the pit lane earlier today at Silverstone. This is it in Miami, the spec they'd run so far this season. Have a look here. You can see they've opened up the cooling for Miami. Hot conditions, it's Florida, of course they're going to open it up. And they've opened up the cooling gills here quite significantly as well. Now, that's nothing new. You see that spine cooler opened and closed throughout the season. Have a look then again at the Silverstone version, and you can see while McLaren's closed up these side coolers, there's only one gill open on either side of the car. They've also closed up partially that centerline cooler. You can also see these new, what I like to call suspension outlet coolers, where the team are kind of using the regulations in their favour to open up the rear suspension ever so slightly to have a look at how they can extract the air from underneath the bodywork. So as you can see, they've revised this cooling layout quite significantly. And why I call them suspension coolers is that the regulations are quite clear that you're not allowed additional openings on the rear bodywork unless it's to allow the suspension movement. And as you can see, the rear wishbones come out of this big old slot. Now, this upper section of the slot, clearly nothing to do with suspension movement, but it is within the regulations, and a number of teams doing this. So McLaren revising their cooling layout underneath the bodywork. Of course, upgraded factories are not unique to the British branded teams, and McLaren, even though it's named after a New Zealand racing driver, has always been based in Britain. The very French Alpine team is based not far from Silverstone in Oxfordshire, and that factory too has had some significant upgrades, not least to the buildings, but also to their personnel. I'm used to seeing this fella in red. It's David Sanchez, and now he's wearing blue.
Big curiosity when I turned up in Enstone. The site has grown a lot since last time I was there. I would say all the ingredients are definitely in place. Now it's about us at the factory making the most of everything and focusing on the car.
Now, it may sound strange, but Mercedes, their home race is also Silverstone, the British Grand Prix being the home to a German team, except the team is actually based literally just down the road, a couple of junctions on the A43 dual carriageway road from the main gate at Silverstone. Not quite as close as Aston Martin and not quite as British. I mean, Toto Wolff doesn't sound like he's from Northamptonshire. However, the car very definitely is, and Mercedes have brought a significant upgrade package to this race. Starting with low drag front brake ducts. They're slightly smaller than normal, as you can see here, and you typically see teams slim it down. Silverstone is a high-speed, high-downforce circuit, so being a high-speed circuit with no really big braking zones, you can slim down those brake ducts. Though Mercedes are one of the only teams to do that. You can see it a little bit more clearly here. In previous races, of course, you remember the brake ducts come out like this. They've reduced that by almost 50%. And in turn with that, they'll have reduced the aerodynamic drag. But what goes in must come out. And you can see a really nice example of the exit duct for the Mercedes just here. And it's got these lovely little details in, these lovely little aerodynamic details. And you can see them here, really beautiful, really sculpted, two vertical, wobbly sticky-uppy bits, I guess you have to call them, in the brake air outlet for the front brake ducts. And they're really playing around with that airflow around the front wheel. We heard Andrea Stella talking about how important the airflow around the front wheel was. Well, Mercedes here is playing the same game, and I wonder if that's a big area of development we're going to see more and more teams playing with as this rule set comes towards its natural conclusion. Now, of course, it was actually something just in front of those brake ducts that I find most interesting as part of this Mercedes upgrade package. And you can see it here, the real complexity of the front wing end plate and the union with the front wing elements. Mercedes have always been pretty experimental in this area, and they've taken things to a new height with this upgrade package. Have a look at how the wing elements, well, I don't know if you really say join the front wing end plate. They're vaguely in contact with it. They're in the same postcode, shall we say. But some of these elements here, I mean, the linkage has its own end plate, and you can see what the team are really trying to do here. It's all about generating that outwashing effect and managing that airflow around the front wheel, around the wake of that front wing, around the tyre that's rotating. It's really complex. It's quite late in the rule set to see this level of advancement, but it could be something a lot of teams are going to be taking a really close look at. Certainly, when you look at it from behind, it looks nowhere near as complex as it does for when you look at that side view. But look here, another one of those little spiky rear elements. So it looks like McLaren starting a trend, though Mercedes would have had this in the wind tunnel long before they saw the McLaren version. Well, also staying close to Silverstone, another foreign-owned team owned by the Austrians, and you hear the Austrian national anthem played whenever Red Bull win, which is quite often followed. It usually follows the Dutch national anthem, occasionally the Mexican national anthem. Red Bull, not much to see here on the upgrade they bought for Silverstone, but a new floor for the Red Bull. And I think it's going to be more significant than it looks. No massive visible changes, unless you really get into the detail quite close up. But I think it's going to have a big performance difference. And I've heard some claims from inside the team that they're expecting quite a lot from this. We'll have to see as the weekend goes on. And even actually as we go into future races, because the wet conditions at Silverstone may not allow all of these upgrades to show what they can do. But it's not just the British-based teams that have bought upgrades to Silverstone. A British sort of based team, but it's American-owned, but the cars are very much built in Italy, is Haas. Now, the Haas team has bought a major upgrade package to Silverstone. And I'm not just going to start by looking at the rear view mirrors. They have had to completely redesign the rear view mirrors and the rear view mirror support. And the reason they've had to do this is they've completely redesigned the side pod ducts. Now, if you remember, at the start of the season, the lower part of the side pod duct extended quite far forwards, and they had a duct entry going like that. The new upgrade package, just on the car of Oliver Bearman and Kevin Magnussen in free practice 1 and 2, has this protruding upper section, which is a major departure from what the team had run previously. Now, I'm not sure if the team have changed everything underneath the bodywork, but to explain a little bit more about this upgrade package, let's head down to the pit lane.
So we work on the bodywork of the car. Then we also changed the front floor. It's not change of concept, we just revised the concept we already introduced this year. Then we slightly changed the concept of the lateral floor, and we re-optimized the rear corner quadruplane.
One of the biggest gains that Haas have made this season, especially compared to previous seasons, is how they use their tyres in races. Previously, the Haas used to be a tyre eater, but this season Haas seems to have got around the tyre management issues they've experienced in the past. So let's find out a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so let's see that we work quite a lot on compared to last year, not just on overall downforce of the car, but also to try to improve the sensitivity. So we just got the feedback from the drivers to understand how to better, let's say, to make for them easier to drive the car in order to not let the tires slide and degrade them. So we work quite a lot on the characteristics of the aero.
Of course, as I said, it's not just the British teams with upgrades recently. One of the most significant upgrades, but one of the ones that's almost completely invisible, is to the Sauber. Now, Sauber, you probably remember, earlier in the season, had an absolute nightmare time with pit stops, but they seem to have solved that problem in recent races. And to find out more, let's go back down to the pit lane.
The old system was a bit too fragile, so I had to change the design and the materials. That took a bit of time. We did first an introduction in Imola and then the second introduction in Barcelona. Now we are more robust. Now the pit crew has more confidence, and now we can start to work on performance.
Now, with a lot more races to come, the high-speed circuits at Spa and Monza, the low-speed circuits but in high temperatures in Hungary and possibly in Zandvoort as well, before we go on to flyaways in Singapore and some of the circuits to come, there's a lot more development to come from these 2024 cars. And let's not forget, those engineers can't turn their attention to the new rules for 2026 until the 1st of January. So all they can do is develop these cars for a little bit longer. And I, for one, cannot wait to see what turns up in the races to come.